So yeah, like Blake said, and like you guys have read in the messages, we're talking about vocational discernment today, which I feel like that word can be like a really big word that we don't really use a lot anymore. I don't know how often you guys use the word vocation in your daily vocabulary. But another word that we often will like substitute for it or use interchangeably with it is calling. I think ultimately like the idea of vocation or the idea of calling can sometimes be this like elusive idea of like your ultimate purpose in life, like that thing that like answers all of life's questions, whether it be what career should I be in, or who should I date, or who should I marry, what am I supposed to do with my life, like why am I here, who am I, like all of those things. um, and I think it's this idea that like we'll never be satisfied with anything until we find that thing that we call a calling. Yet I think that so much damage can also be done with this concept that we have of calling. Like this, it's like this constructed idea of like, some of you are saying like, it's even like, this is the thing that I have to figure out that I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And I think so much damage can be done with that, that we sometimes become discontent with our lives. And I think that there can be often like a lot of fear and anxiety around, like I said, the concept of vocation. And especially in university, when you're wondering whether you're in the right program, getting into the right co-ops, or just making the right decisions about where you're going with your future. And that's a lot of pressure. I feel like a lot of us put this pressure on ourselves to know everything about our lives by the time we're like 22 or by the time we're like 18. And it's like, that's so much pressure for us to try and figure that all out. And so this teaching isn't going to be like a how-to. Like by the end of this, you're not going to be like, I know exactly what I'm doing with my life. That would be really nice, but I hope that it can at least bring some amount of clarity to this topic and to vocation or calling. So I think that, like I mentioned earlier, like vocation isn't necessarily a word that we use very often, but I think often it can bring this connotation of either like priestly or ministry calling, or it can also be, like a lot of you mentioned, like this secular understanding of vocation to be synonymous with a job or an occupation or a career. But I think that if we solely look at it on that basis, like what happens if we can no longer work because we have like an injury or because of old age? Or what happens if a minister has a moral failure? And like in those kinds of situations, is calling just all of a sudden forfeited? Like does that person no longer have a calling because they can't do their job? And I think that the idea of vocation has to be so much more rich and complex than just our Western perspective of productivity or career achievement. It calls for like balance, and I think it entails so much more than just our jobs, but also our family life and our creative interests and pursuits, and all of these things are just like different aspects of our calling, but not necessarily our sole calling. And there's one author, he says that basically anything we do with our time and talents and resources can be infused with this sense of vocation. But I do want to be really careful with saying that, because I think that vocation isn't just what we do in life, but it's also about who we are and who we're becoming. And so the point that in all of what I just said, the point that you maybe like got tastes of this already, but the point I want to make right off the bat is that vocation or calling in life isn't singular, but it's multifaceted. Just like we often wear different hats depending on the environment that we're in, or depending on the setting that we're in. I, for example, I'm called to be a campus minister, but I'm also called to be a wife and a daughter and a friend and a disciple. And in a similar way, like one calling can often lead to another, and our callings can even change throughout our lives based on the season that we're in, or how we grow and mature as a person. I think of, for example, the way that you like right now, you guys are contemplating your life maybe, and that's gonna look so much more different than when you're approaching retirement. Like how you think about vocation is gonna look so much differently than how you think of it when you're approaching retirement. So in all this, I feel like maybe you guys are still wondering, okay, you haven't answered your original question of what is calling though, what is vocation? Not just the concept of it, because I think we talked a bit about that, but that concept that can sometimes damage us and make us feel like we're missing it. but I mean like the actual nature of calling, the actual nature of vocation. So let's look at the roots, because I like to look at words. So we're gonna look at if you look at vocation at like the Latin root of the word, the Latin comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call, and vox, which means voice. And they both center around this experience of hearing a call or a voice. And so essentially what that means is that to have a call implies that there's a caller. It implies that something, or like that someone is calling or beckoning us somewhere or to something. And I think that this is like the first point that I want to make, is that like without believing that someone is calling us, we're just blindly searching without knowing the way. In 3 of the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus says, "He who has an ear to hear, let him listen." And if you guys have been tracking with us in TNF of like our series with Revelation, in the letter to every single one of the churches, Jesus says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." And it's this idea that Jesus is calling his church and his people. So first, before like I'm gonna get into later on like kind of the 3 different types of calling and how we discern our calling, but I think before we get to any of that, like we have to recognize that first we have to believe that we have a caller, that we have somebody who is calling us. And a great example of this is found in the Bible, classic. If you guys have your Bibles, you can turn to it, but like no pressure to. I'm gonna just loosely follow the story anyways. But in 1 Samuel chapter 3, I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with that story. I'll give you a second. But just like a little bit of context, Samuel ended up being this like huge prophet. He wrote both 1st and 2nd Samuel. And but he was kind of like a miracle child. And so his mom couldn't conceive, and she like prayed and prayed and prayed, and the Lord, granted her a child. And so she promised that she would dedicate it to him. And so, I can't remember how old he was when he like went into the temple, but she like dedicated him to the Lord, like brought him to the temple, and he grew up under the like guidance of Eli, who was the priest at the time. And so here's like young Eli. I think he was like, young Samuel. I mean, it just says he was just a boy. It doesn't say how old he was, but the story in chapter 3 goes that he was like resting in the temple of the Lord. He was sleeping in the temple of the Lord, and he hears this call. It's just his name. It's just Samuel. And so he gets up and he like runs to Eli, who is usually the person who would be calling him, and he says, "Here I am." And Eli is like, "No, I didn't call you. Let me sleep. Go back to bed." And so he like goes back to bed, and he's like, "Okay, that was weird." So he like goes back to bed. Here's again Samuel. So he like goes back to Eli and is like, "Here I am." And Eli's like, "No, stop bugging me. Go back to bed." So he like goes back, and the 3rd time he hears the same thing, Samuel. And so he goes to Eli and he's like, "Here I am." And finally Eli was like, "Oh wait, I think that this might be God," because like Eli had no idea. And even he didn't know that it was God that was calling, but all of a sudden he was like, "Oh my gosh, this might be God." So if you hear this again, say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And so again, Samuel goes back, and he goes back to sleep, and he hears, "Samuel, Samuel." And he says, "Speak, your servant is listening." And God like proceeds to unfurl like this whole plan that he has for like basically like taking Eli out of leadership. It's a whole long story that I'm not going to totally get into. But there's a lot that we can find out of this text of like how God calls Samuel. And the first point that I want to make in all of this is that it happens in rest. If you notice, like in chapter, I think it's in chapter 2 or chapter 3, Samuel was laying down in the temple of the Lord. He wasn't striving. He wasn't like earnestly trying to like manufacture God's voice for his life, but he was just resting. And I think that for us, like we can sometimes like, I don't know if you guys are anything like me, I'm like, I want to figure it out, and I want to figure it out now. So Lord, here's your space, time to speak. And like, and that's I think that God is like, "No, you're missing the point. Like, just rest in me." And so I think from this story, we can see first that like God speaks in rest. God calls us in rest when we're resting in him. And the second thing is, if you notice, God called Samuel 4 times in this story, and I think that speaks to that. If it's God, he's gonna call again. I think again, if you guys are anything like me, I like sometimes got like paralyzed by the fear that I was gonna miss it. And I don't know if you felt like that before, that like you're just going through life, but you're like so scared that you're gonna miss the reason why you're here. You're so scared that like you're gonna miss God's call on your life. And sometimes we want that Samuel story, you know, it's like, okay, God, I'm gonna go where you want me to, but like you just need to speak in a booming voice like Katrina, and I'll do what you say. But it's not always like that. And so I think that it's this assurance that we can see from this story, that like, because Samuel didn't get it at first, even his mentor Eli didn't get it at first. And I think that we don't get it at first, but if it's God calling you, we can be assured that he's going to call us again, and we're not going to miss it. And the third thing that we see in this passage is even just Samuel's openness. He made himself available to God, and I think that that's our call, is to make ourselves available to God. The words that he says, that Eli teaches him to say, is, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." There's this awesome quote by an author, his name's John Neefse, and it says, "Following the voice of God ultimately requires that we let go of our own will or wishes in order to submit or surrender to the will of a power greater than our ego, potentially at considerable personal cost." It's like we come to God and say, this is maybe our plans, this is maybe what we want to happen in our lives, but we need to have that humility to lay it down at Jesus's feet and say, God, speak, your servant is listening. I just want you. Like even I think of Jesus's prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he says, "Not my will, but yours be done." He says, "Lord, if it's your will, like, would this cup be taken away from me, but not my will, but yours be done." And I think that we need to have that posture too. We need to have that attitude too. Like, we shouldn't be saying, "God, just show me what to do so that I don't need you anymore." But instead, "God, I just want you, and I'll go wherever you call." It's that idea of seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all the other things are going to be added to us. And that's what we see in this passage, is just like being humble before God. Okay, so that's kind of the context for when we're talking about even just like the root of what calling is. And I wanted to kind of have that as a basis before we go into like the types of calling, just because I think that if we don't believe that there's somebody calling us, it doesn't matter what we believe about the types of calling, because that's literally the nature of the word. That's the nature of what it is. So yeah, that being said, let's move into 3 different types of calling. And this is where I'll get maybe a little bit of interaction from you guys too. There's 3 different types of calling that I think that we're all called to. And the first is universal call. The second is collective, and the third is specific. So with the universal call, this is like the call of every human or every disciple. Before God calls us to do anything for him, God calls us to just be with him. God calls us to himself. Like, there's a reason, I think maybe you've heard the cliche before, but like there's a reason why we're not called human doings, but we're called human beings, right? We're called to be with him, and God has called us first to himself. And it's this idea of intimacy with God. In the Old Testament, there's, I don't know if you guys have heard of the Shema before, but it's from Deuteronomy 6:4, and it's love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And Jesus quotes it in the New Testament, and he says that this is like the greatest commandment, is to love. And he says, like, he adds in mind there, so heart, soul, mind, and strength. And like, this is our first calling as disciples. This is our first calling as followers of Jesus, is just intimacy with God. It's that, like, if nothing else in our life, if we have no idea what else to do in our lives, first seek him, be in relationship with him, because God has called us to himself first. And the second point in this is that, like, and I can't remember who touched on it. But yeah, even just like the Great Commission of like make disciples. Like if you, the Great Commission of like, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And it's this like, I think it's this extension of like that Old Testament call to love God, but it's like, okay, now out of that, we get to go and like invite other people into this. We get to go and invite other people into this like love that we've experienced, this like life that we've experienced. And it's not out of this like duty to just like, okay, I'm like a Christian soldier that needs to just like do this task, but it's like, no, we get to invite people into this. And this is like, it's not just something that we have to do, but it's this something that like we are called to and that we get to do as disciples of Jesus. And then thirdly, like there's, if you guys have heard Micah 6:8, which I think is this verse that kind of like brings all of those things together. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. It's that that idea of like, okay, in the New Testament, it's like, it's like that, or the second part of like that intimacy with God of like love the Lord your God. It's also like love others as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so it's like, do justice, like absolutely go and like be part of social justice movements, be part of the justice that God is like wanting to like bring to this world. But then it's also to love mercy, to be compassionate on one another, to care for one another, to go out of our way to like be merciful. And then it's also like we were talking about with Samuel, it's to walk humbly with our God, to lay down our like desires, but just to walk with him. And it's that whatever you do, whether you're a professor, whether you're a taxi driver, whether you're an artist, our fundamental human vocation is to become just, loving, and humble people. I think, like I said earlier, our calling is so much more than just about what we do, but it's about who we are becoming and who we're called to become. And I think that this begins with how we treat our loved ones and the people that are closest to us, but then it extends outwards as we consider the next aspect of our calling, which is collective. So we talked about how one type of calling is the universal calling, and then the second one is the collective calling. And this one might be, I think, a little bit more abstract for us to understand, because we live in such a individualistic culture that it's like, oh, it's all about me and my relationship with God, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we see so much throughout scripture of how God has also called a collective group of people. And so that's what the second point is, it's the collective call is how God has led a specific group to follow him. So I asked my husband these same questions, and he came up with so many more answers than I had even anticipated when he but he was even saying things like charities or organizations like that. I used to work for a nonprofit that was it was a homeless shelter. And their collective call was to provide housing and to provide a safe place for the displaced people in Edmonton. So even that can be a specific call and how God has called a collective. Or, I mean, what about UCM? How has God called us as a UCM community? What are the things that he has led us to? And I even just think of one of our mission, or our mission is to that we would see every student on campus have one trusted Christian friend and have had an opportunity to hear the gospel. That's a call, and that's, I think, even how God can call us as a collective. And this is something that we see throughout scripture too. There's so many, if you read the prophets, there's so many stories of the prophets or God through the prophets calling a community, a specific group, the Israelites, whether it's the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, to repent. Or in the New Testament, there's so many different letters to different groups of churches where God is calling them to a specific thing, whether it's the Corinthians to not be sexually immoral, or the Ephesians to be one in body. And so I think that we also see that as well, where God calls a specific group. And I think of Galatians 5:13, where it says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another." And it's this idea that that we are, yes, we are individuals, but we are individuals to benefit the. And so it's, how is God calling me to be a part of this community? Yeah, so that's kind of the idea of collective. So we've talked about the universal call, we've talked about the collective call, but maybe you're still like, okay, Katrina, what about me? This is like, I thought that this was going to be more about like, where am I going? What am I doing with my life? And that's where we talk about like specific calling, because that is definitely a huge aspect, because God has made us all unique. And so a specific call is how an individual is led by God to a specific vocation. And I think that there's a few ways that we can discern that. And maybe this is the part that you're like most interested in. But the three things that I want to talk about in this is, we can discern this through affinity, and we can discern this through ability, and we can discern this through opportunities. So the first one is affinity, and it's this idea of looking out. I think that our instinct when we're trying to figure out, okay, what am I, like, what should I be doing for the rest of my life? Or like, what am I called to? Our instinct is to look in right away. But I think that if we start with ourselves, our self-knowledge is often so limited. Our knowledge of ourselves is often so limited. And it's often like, we're surprised by the gifts that we have when we're placed in situations that we wouldn't have expected otherwise. And so affinity is this idea of, what needs do I resonate? When I look at the world, when I look at what there is out there, what are the things that resonate with my heart and how I want to? And I don't even necessarily just mean like ministry wise, like, oh, are you called to like go to another country and like feed the poor, or like are you called to build wells and effort? Like, I don't even necessarily mean that, but I just mean like, even in your own community, what are the things that you're drawn to? What resonates with you in terms of how you want to be a part of the community? And not even necessarily a job wise, but what kind of people or ministry needs move you, and like what things burden you? What are the desires of your heart that you found in your life that you've been like led back to? So that's this idea of affinity and looking out first. And the second one is ability. So it's looking in. It's saying, I don't know about you guys. I sometimes strive way too hard to be like a well-rounded person, that I've in the past been like, okay, here's my strengths, here's my weaknesses. Okay, these are good, so I'm just gonna not think about them, but my weaknesses, I need to make them perfect. And so I'll like just focus on my weaknesses, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for us to grow in our areas of weakness. But I think that God has given us strengths. God has given us gifts and talents and skills for a reason, because that's like, those are the things that we get to cultivate and that we get to use for His glory. And so this idea of like ability is, it's asking yourself, what is authentically me? Like, what do I naturally have a skill for? What do I naturally have a gifting for? If you're like terrified of public speaking, and you like don't like to say more than 3 words in public, and you like get the shakes, and like, maybe you shouldn't be a public speaker. Like, I don't know, that's just, to me, that seems like common sense. And I don't know, maybe God is calling you into that. Don't let me stifle that. But I think that we can discern things through the raw gifts that we have. And that's not a bad thing. That's actually a really good thing. There's this quote by a guy named Frederick Buechner that I love, and it's that the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's hunger meet. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's hunger meet. So it's like, we've looked out and we've seen, okay, what is the world hungry for? And where do I like have an affinity towards? But then it's also asking yourself, like, what brings me deep gladness? And like, I think that when those things collide, that's the sweet spot. Like, you found that spot where it's like, you get to be so like fulfilled by what you're doing, but you're also like there's like the world's deep hunger. And yeah, I think it's asking, what am I good at? What am I bad at? What makes sense? It makes sense for us to operate in our strengths. And even within this, I know I talked about like the call to ministry, and maybe that is your call. But I do want to stress here too that like all forms of work are God honoring. To be a farmer or an artist or a craftsman is as much of a vocation as a preacher, because God has created us all uniquely. If you guys have read the book of Exodus, maybe you skipped over the part where it's talking about like the construction of the tabernacle, because it's like long, and it's like bring 1 ephah of this and 1/4 of an ephah of this, and like then there's pomegranates being attached to something. I don't know, it's really weird. So maybe you've read that, or maybe you've just skimmed over it, but there's this really beautiful section in there in Exodus 31, and we read how this guy named Bezalel was filled with the Spirit of God, with skill, ability, and knowledge in all kinds of crafts to make artistic designs. It's this idea that like he was a carpenter, like he was like a crafty guy, like he was creative, and God used this gift that he'd been given to bring him glory. He used this gift that he had been given to like further his kingdom. And I think that like the things that we get to do in life can do the same thing, can also be part of the same thing, if we are submitting them to the Lord. So we talked about how we can discern our specific calling through affinity and ability, and then the third one is through opportunities. And this is now like this idea of like looking up. And so I think it's asking yourself the question of, what have I already had opportunities in, and what have I already seen myself be effective in, and even like to like further that, like where have others affirmed me in? If you've maybe had opportunities and people have been like, ooh, like you shouldn't do this, I don't know, maybe that's something to listen to. Like definitely test it, but like maybe that's something to listen to. Or if you've had opportunities that you've just totally hated. But sometimes I think that it's this idea of our call can often come out of a place of experience. I think that your life isn't just a series of random events, but your family background, your education, and your life experiences, even the ones that are the most painful, all of these things equip you to do some work that no one else can do. Think about that for a second. All of your background, your family background, your educational background, even your most painful experiences, they all equip you to do something that nobody else can do. I just feel like there's so many people in this call. Like I even just think of like Paul and Blake, like I like knowing bits of their stories. Like they were specifically like the hurts and the hardships that they've gone through were specifically like catered, or like were like enabled them to do something that nobody else can. I think very often our experiences, or the experiences we have like become the platform that we get to stand on to minister to or to help others. I have a cousin who, for example, she pretty much sucked in high school. Like her grades were so bad, like she barely passed. And a big reason why it was like this is because she actually had this really rare genetic disorder where her blood would periodically thin or clot. And so she was just like often so sick, and she was like would get really dizzy. But she became so intrigued by what was going on in her body, and so interested by what was going on in her body, that she like did so much research, and she just like poured herself into trying to understand it. And she like eventually just was like, oh my gosh, I know so much about genes and like science, that she like went and got her PhD in pharmacology and like taught at Trinity and is now a doctor in Surrey. And it's this idea of like her history inspired her direction. And I think that for so many of us, our history can inspire the direction that we go in life. So with this, we've talked about how we discern our call through affinity and ability and opportunities. But the fourth thing that I really want to like lean on here too, and just like in all of that, is that we can look at all those things, but ultimately we need to come back to like those pillars of like, the call that God has on our life is confirmed by the Spirit of God, like our relationship with God, what we hear him speaking to us, the Word of God. Like, guys, we have to be going back to the Bible. Like, even just like the like our universal call, like that's where we find these things. That's like, even this morning in my quiet time, I was like, just so like my call, I feel like, was so confirmed. I was just like brought to peace when I went to the Word. And then it's also confirmed through others. Like I said, where have people affirmed you in your giftings? Where have people affirmed you in your opportunities? Because we're not just like called to ourselves, but God calls us together as a community. Okay, so I feel like I did a lot of talking, but I asked you guys at the beginning, like, what some of your fears are around calling. And I want to talk about this a little bit more, just because I think that we can so often, like, that can cripple us to taking a step. And so I have like 3 disclaimers and like 3 fears that I just want to quickly talk about. And the first is, what if I make the wrong step? I can't remember who said that at the first, or at like, when maybe Jared, it was you, but it was just this idea of like, what if I make the wrong step? And to this, I want to say that God matures us or grows us in maturity to make wise steps. I think of like, okay, think with me of like this 8-year-old kid who goes to his dad and is like, hey dad, can I go outside and play with my friends? And the dad's like, yeah, sure. Just make sure that you've got your homework done and you're back by 5:30 in time for dinner. And so the kid goes and plays. Fast forward 10 years, kid is 18, he's in university, goes into his dorm and calls up his dad and is like, hey dad, a bunch of the guys are throwing football out on the quad. Can I go and play with them? Like, what's the dad gonna say? He's gonna be like, I don't know. Like, you know your workload, you know what you have on your plate. Like, use the wisdom that I've like taught you, like use your discernment and how I've grown you up in wisdom to make a decision. And I say this not to say that God is disinterested in our decisions, because I think he is, but I think that and so I think that we should still ask him, we should still like pray and ask God, like, what do you want for me? Is this like, or like, where do you want me to go? What step do I want to make? But then it's also saying, okay, God, you've grown me up and you've given me wisdom, and then it's making a step. I'll just share this story really quick of like me coming to UCM even after I graduated. So I graduated after 8 long years of post-secondary. I graduated last April from my degree, and I remember being like, I have no idea where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing. And I actually had this opportunity to interview at my old college as a program director. And I was like, this is awesome. This is totally like based on what I know and what I've discerned about like my ability, my affinity, and my like opportunities that I've had. This is totally like where I think God could call me to. So I went and I interviewed for this position. And then at the end, obviously I didn't get it. And I was like kind of disappointed. But the cool thing was that like right after I interviewed for UCM, and like this was such a better fit. And so it's just this idea of like, I made a step, and it's not that it was necessarily like the wrong step, but it was just a step, and God through that was like, no, actually I'm going to bring you back over here. And so I want to speak to that fear of like, I don't know. I think that we're allowed to make steps, and it doesn't necessarily make them the wrong one. And I think this goes along with a second fear that I kind of alluded to earlier of like, what if I miss my calling? What if I miss that thing? What if I don't get it, and then I let God down because I just missed it? And I think that to that I would ask, were you ever holding God up? I think that, yeah, we might think that like, oh, I'm gonna let God down, but the reality is like we might think that like, oh yeah, I'm holding him up, like, well, like if I like waver a little bit, he's gonna fall down. But it's like, no, we're not underneath God. Like, he's holding us up. He's the one directing us. And it's this idea of going back to the Samuel story and saying, and humbly coming before God and seeking him first. And that's where he's going to guide us. Like, we don't have to worry about missing it. But when we humbly seek him first, he's going to guide us. I think there's a verse in 1 Corinthians, or like a chunk in 1 Corinthians that I'm going to read to you. It's from chapter 1, verse 25 to 29. And it says, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to things, or to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human might be able to boast in the presence of God." I wonder if what you perceive to be a mistake is actually what God is going to use to bring glory. Maybe you're so afraid of making the wrong step. Maybe you're afraid you're in the wrong program. Maybe you're afraid that, like, after you graduate, what if I, or like even now, like, what if I get the wrong co-op? What if I get the wrong job out of university? Like, maybe the mistake that you think you're making is actually what God wants to use to bring glory. A small shot or snapshot of my story. When I was, so I'm 20, I'm almost 27 now. When I was 21, I was engaged to be married to someone who's not my husband right now. So long story short, we ended up breaking up after I think it was like 7 months of being engaged. And like, honestly, that was like, I mean, it was one of the worst experiences of my life. But the biggest thing was that I was so afraid that I had made this like horrible mistake, and for so long afterwards I saw it as like this mistake, like this black mark on my record, like I made this huge mistake by like even choosing to like be engaged in the first place. But guys, like the coolest thing about it is that like I was like that instance in my life, that experience in my life has become this platform that I've been able to speak into the lives of so many people who are heartbroken because of that experience that I've had. Or even like in the moment, like I learned so much about how my hope isn't in any relationship. My hope isn't in any, like anything that this world has to offer me, but my hope is ultimately only in Jesus Christ, because that's something that can never be shaken. And so I just want to encourage you guys that like, I'm not saying that there's necessarily no such thing as a mistake, but I'm saying that like, I wonder if what we perceive to be mistakes is actually something that God wants to use. And so just be encouraged in that as you discern where you're going. And then the third one is that you might still be asking, but I don't know where I'm going. And I think that sometimes God is more concerned with the journey that we're on, like who you are and the relationship that you have with him, than he is with our destination, getting to where you're going. Like, don't get me wrong, I think that both are important. Like, obviously, God cares about the destination, but I think we so often put all of our emphasis on the destination, like just getting there. I just gotta like finish this test so I can finish this course, so I can finish this degree, so I can get on with my life. And I wonder if God is like, but where are you right now? You don't miss what I have for you right now. Even I think of Samuel, like, what does he say? He says, "Here I am." Not in the future I am, but like, here I am right now. What is God teaching you right now where you are? Maybe you guys grew up in the church and so you know the verse and you've heard it a ton of times. Psalm 119, 105, where it says, "The word is a light unto my feet, or a lamp unto my feet and a light into my path." And I want to like focus on that for a second, like a light unto my feet or a lamp unto my feet and a light to my path. He says a light to my path, not a spotlight on my destination. A light to my path, not a spotlight on my destination. I think that sometimes we want God to like take this like torch light and just like light up our destination, light up where we're going. But I think if you were to do that, I don't know, like, I think half of us would see where we're going and we'd run in the other direction and be like, no way in heck am I going that way. Not happening. Or we would like see it and we would run straight to it and we'd miss all of the things along the path that we're supposed to pick up in the meantime. We'd miss the lessons that we're supposed to learn. And then we'd get to the end, or we'd get to the destination And we'd be like, oh shoot, I have no idea how to handle this. Oh shoot, I have no idea what I'm doing here because we missed what God was teaching us along the journey. And it's this idea of like that Proverbs verse where it's trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your path straight. As he lights up just like one step and then one step, just what's in front of our feet, one step and then one step, and trusting that like he knows where he's leading you. He knows where he's taking you. Like in Genesis 12, there's the story of Abram before he becomes Abram, and God's call before like the promise. He says, "Come and follow me to the land that I will show you." Could you imagine if somebody's like, come with me, I'm gonna show you where I'm gonna take you. And you're like, well, but where am I going? Like, will you tell me where I'm going first? And then I'll come with you. But no, he says, come and follow me to the land that I will show you. He doesn't say, come, I'm gonna bring you to Haran and then Canaan and Egypt and then Jerusalem and then all the world is gonna know about you. No, he just says, come to the place that I will show you. I think God is calling us to trust. God is calling us to not worry. It's not that we don't need to think about tomorrow, like to think and to make plans. That's fine, but it's to not worry about tomorrow because this God of the universe is in control. So don't worry. It's not worrying about tomorrow, but it's seeking him humbly, making a step and trusting that he's in control.